Okay, I think we're going to get started. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? It is my privilege to just say a few brief introductory remarks for our speaker today, Professor Detlef Sprinz, who is a fellow political scientist who works on environmental governance internationally, especially on climate change. There is far too much to read about his really important CV and bio, so I'm going to highlight just a few key contributions that he's made. He's currently a Rice Faculty Fellow and visiting a professor in the European Studies Council at the Macmillan Center here at Yale, and also appointed in our own school and the Department of Political Science, where he's teaching a range of courses on environment and international relations. His permanent posting is as a senior scientist with a research in the research domain, transdisciplinary concepts and methods at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, and also a professor in the Faculty of Economic and Social Sciences at the University of Potsdam in Germany. He's worked a lot on the question of how climate governance might lead to long-term policy solutions, and in this capacity has performed as a guest editor and author in a number of prestigious journals, including an editor of a special issue of Global Environmental Politics on long-term environmental policy, and has also published books with MIT Press on international relations and climate change. In fact, he's about to have an edited book come out from MIT Press called Global Climate Change in an International Context. And just recently, he's been selected to be a lead author for the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report on global agreements. So that's a brief review of Detlef's CV. What I want to also emphasize is that in the field of global environmental politics, one of the key questions has been to reflect on the effectiveness of international environmental agreements. And how do we think about that kind of question? Some scholars argue that when it comes to effectiveness, that the environmental governance community didn't just do great work for the environment, but also contributed to the broader field of international relations generally, by thinking more carefully about how we think about the causal impacts of agreements on problems. In that community, there are essentially three schools of thought. One I would argue is being offered by Gabriel Cutting, one by Oren Young, who does complementary but also a little bit different approaches to effectiveness, and then the what's known as the Oslo-Potsdam solution, which has been cited, if you Google it, not now, but after the talk, you Google this, it's been cited like crazy. It's a really important school, and Detlef is one of the founders of that school. Really systematic and thoughtful ways to think about effectiveness that I've been teaching in my class for the last 17 years. So it's a little brief snippet to say we're very fortunate to have Detlef here for the year and to contribute to our community, and also today to talk about one of our favorite topics, Donald Trump. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? So, thank you, Ben, for this very personal introduction. What you see here is actually the old main headquarters of PIK, and I'll show you the new ones shortly. Let me just take the chance to say a few words of what we do at PIK. We're an institute that spans, much like the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, the natural and the social sciences. I normally like to reverse the order, but also we are very interdisciplinary, and I'm de facto in a transdisciplinary department of concepts and methods, which of course shapes a little bit what I will present shortly. We have a lot of models at PIK, but we have also people doing comparative case study, and I do actually both. We were fortunate that this year, 25 years after our founding, we made some ranking on the top. Of course, we quote that. If we are not doing so well, we wouldn't quote it. So a nice coincidence. I've also been affiliated, when I looked up those rankings, with Ecologic as a co-founder 20 years ago, which actually also made it to the top 10, which is astounding how things are shaped in the last couple of decades. We also like forests. This is actually a building in the forest. That's our new low-energy building, research building, where actually also my office is in Potsdam. Come and see us if you want to work with us. I'm sure there's interest here in Yale. Hopefully with Potsdam, certainly there's interest in Potsdam vis-a-vis Yale. What will I be talking about? I will talk about bottom-up perspectives, meaning voluntary action in some sense among countries in this case, regarding climate mitigation. I will have a short slide on the pointing research question after I give a background. I will outline the methods and the data, and then show you the results, and conclude briefly. The whole presentation actually originates from a meeting in the German Bundestag, our federal parliament, where shortly after the election of Donald Trump for president, we had a meeting of the German Council on Foreign Relations with parliamentarians and others, including the US Embassy, and nobody seemed to know what could Donald Trump and his announcements during the campaign mean for global climate policy. We wondered too, but we had a general model that we tweaked for the purpose. And so I will introduce you to both the general model as well as the one that may shed some light on what is the potential impact of a Trump presidency on bottom-up architectures for global climate mitigation. And all of this work, I draw on several articles and manuscripts, is together with Jon Hovey, Arild Underdahl. They are also co-founders of the Oslo-Potsdam solution, as well as Håkon Seelen. I go through this very quickly. I'm sure at this school, climate literacy is extremely high. We have a first Kyoto Protocol that had only restrictions on industrialized countries regarding mitigation. There's full compliance, but not much of a break in emissions. A second Kyoto Protocol with much reduced membership, and we're not sure if everyone will comply ultimately until 2020. What we know from the Global Carbon Project, that until a couple of years ago, it seemed as if absolute greenhouse gas emissions are leveling off. However, we have seen the last report, they are bending back upwards. And we have a Paris Agreement of 2015, which is an architecture with a highly ambitious goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius temperature change, global mean temperature change over pre-industrial temperatures. We have global participation, no problem on that side, but we have no binding emission targets, and few, if any, incentives to actually mitigate coming from the agreement itself. There may be some on the domestic level. In fact, what I will present has some origins and some connections to Yale. Roughly in 2013, when we were thinking about our work, I was sitting in the Hofburg together, this is the Imperial Palace in Austria, at a conference of the International Institute for Advanced System Analysis. And Bill Nordhaus, who's a faculty member here at the school, as well as in the Department of Economics, gave a presentation with very initial results on his version of a climate club. It's very different in architecture, and we sat in the room and I thought, this is a smart idea. How could we put this into political science term? And we thought immediately of the work of David Victor, who has written about it but never formalized it. So we much in our early developments follow his thinking and our formalization with, of course, additional bells and whistles. We look at 3 types of actors. And the new nomenclature is its leaders, those who might start coalitions of those who want to mitigate. So they're initiators. There are others who may be invited and want then to join. We call them followers. And then, given the Trump announcement, there may be outsiders. We don't know which version Mr. Trump will choose, but outsiders we interpret here as those willing to have nothing to do with the architecture and stay outside no matter what. So what do leaders do? Essentially, they invite others, and they are selfish, to the point that whomever they invite and who adds to mitigation efforts and other public goods production, they must be in the end better off as leaders than they were without the club. So they look at the additional benefits coming from the club compared with the no club situation. Versus followers. Followers only ask them this question, am I and only I better off by joining versus not joining? Not looking at the overall configuration. This is a central difference between initiators or leaders and followers. And outsiders, they simply stay outside. So this goes with the literature by Faulkner and others who look at the 3 ways to look at how bottom-up architectures could be interesting. And what we focus on are incentives for membership. Why should I join? So we don't look so much at the facilitation of dialogues and bargaining, or, which could play a role actually in the case of Donald Trump, at looking at an elevated role for a major power. What is very important to understand the architecture is that we look at 2 things. Mitigation is a global public good, meaning avoided damage everywhere, whether you have contributed or not. No exclusion is possible. And we have a second good, which is co-produced to some degree, and I'll show you the degree in the graphics later, that is something that is for members only. And we normally think of that as preferential trade benefits where others, non-members, can be excluded. And I'll come to that later. So it's the combination of both that may offer, under certain conditions, some way forward. How is this all embedded in our work? We originally, and I don't mention it, we had an article or a chapter in an edited volume where we thought about bottom-up versus top-down. We then published a literature review of the larger area of climate clubs, and then had in the British Journal of Political Science the general model on which everything that I will show is based. And one of our co-authors, Håkon Seinen, as part of his dissertation, wrote an article about side payments, one of the options to build clubs, and I will show you the results later. And of course this piece, which was stimulated by the discussions in the US here during the essentially the preparatory period for the elections during 2016. So what is the research question? It is sharp and crisp, under which conditions, if any, which is a possibility, this is not a normative model, under which conditions might a club geared towards mitigation persist and grow, even if President, in this case President Trump, would withdraw, either switch from leader to follower or from leader to outsider. So we have to define our terms. What is a climate club? There are many definitions out in the literature. What we focus on is any group smaller than the UNFCCC membership, meaning the climate change regime's membership at the UN level, and then allow essentially for a bottom-up coalition building. And there's no need for us to have universal membership. But we show you how gradually that could develop, under which conditions. And we focus on 4 levers. One of them is the role actors take. And I've outlined them already, leaders, followers, or outsiders. The second aspect is whether you have or don't have conditional commitments, meaning you upgrade on your membership fee, and I will come to the membership fee shortly. And that only applies to leaders. Then is the question whether you have a members-only or club benefit to offer, and to which degree, either none or gradually increasing. And fourth, and that's a very alternative mechanism, it's called side payments. Side payments are essentially, I as leader invite you and subsidize your membership fee, meaning offer you a discount. It's a very different mechanism and builds quite a bit on the work that Håkon Seelen did by himself. How do we do and compute all of this? We use an agent-based models that models the interaction among countries. Among those, we have 141. We treat the European Union, including the UK, as one actor as of now. We always allow coalitions to build, but also to fall apart. So it's a search mechanism. If I would have brought the pseudocode with me, but it's published and publicly accessible and open access, you would see you send out invitations to the most likely joiners. They may or may not accept given their calculus. And in the end, each member who came in as followers can sort themselves out, and can the leader. And once that happens, the whole mechanism starts from the beginning until an equilibrium is reached. Our model is empirically calibrated, and there are core ingredients: the role, the gross domestic product a country has, or better, more precisely, its share of the global gross product, the emissions that we have historically in a reference year, and an indicator or a highly aggregated index of vulnerability to climate change. What assumptions do we make in addition? We have open membership. What does open membership mean? As long as you pay the membership fee, which is 1% minimum of GDP to be spent every year, you're in. Nobody can exclude you. We've done sensitivity analysis on that. Even if that is not the case, the results basically uphold. We keep it simple. You're either a member or not, so you cannot have half a foot in or out. You're either in or out. So we also don't deal at this stage with partial compliance. The membership fee I already mentioned, and what is the club benefit? We conceive of it as preferential trade benefits where non-members can be excluded. However, all our modeling is generic. It's a simple homogeneous good that we assume exists. This said, some climate clubs can emerge even without it. And we shall see this shortly. Also, just for ballpark types of figures that we use, we assume that if there were 100% membership in the club, then the global damage costs could be reduced by 3% of global gross product. We did sensitivity analysis. The basic findings do not change by taking off 50% of that figure or adding 50% to the damage figures. If we have a non-perfect, meaning a non-universal membership club, we assume that the benefits accrue linearly with the size of emissions that are represented in the club. And most likely questions will come up on damage costs. Those are, we take the Notre Dame gain index, and the damage costs are also highly influenced by GDP, meaning assets at risk, or at least at potential risk. So here are some of the data and data sources that we use, and I reprint this must be the top 10 countries. Obviously, we have data for everyone that we included, except maybe, I guess, a few small island states where we don't have complete data. You see all the big emitters being represented, all the major countries with economic power, and of course their score on the vulnerability index. And as usual, India should stand out as being the most highly vulnerable if you take country aggregates. And the sources are all mainstream, replicable, and publicly accessible. We did actually our research before that happened. I mean, the announcement on July the 1st, excuse me, in the Rose Garden. We actually were completing it our manuscript shortly before because we had all the announcements from the presidential campaign. And for background, it would be nice to just show 1.5 minutes of that because it provides very suitable background.
On these issues and so many more, we're following through on our commitments, and I don't want anything to get in our way. I am fighting every day for the great people of this country. Therefore, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you. But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or in really entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its businesses, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out, but we will.
Okay, fine. What is important here is it's not quite clear what the replacement for the previous role under Obama will be under President Trump. He left that open. Fortunately, we also left that open in our modeling strategy. So there are three roles we can see for the US. In our original article in the British Journal of Political Science, we assumed it's the Obama government. It was the government of the day, and it acted as a leader in many of our scenarios. However, under President Trump, that doesn't look likely that he wants to be an Obama 2 on climate change. So there are two other options. The US is at maximum willing to become a follower, meaning being invited by others to join. So the calculus would be purely selfish. Or third, it becomes an outsider and says, I want nothing to do with it, I always stay out, and the 14 percentage points that we'll cover will never enter a climate club. So the next 5 slides are de facto empirical results, and then I have a very brief conclusion. These are not easy to read graphs. First of all, it's important that countries enter with their emissions covered. So for the US, that's 14 percentage point. I think it's 9 or 10 for the EU. We would have to look at the blue slide. So that is the ordinate. The other one is what we call the CGB fit, is the essentially the members only benefit, or the club goods benefit scale. If it's 0, obviously there are none. At 0.25, it's extremely generous. However, there's a good marker point. It's 0.1. This is the equivalent to having the transatlantic partnership on trade, which was computed. You will find in our articles the reference. This is something that actual negotiators, meaning diplomats, considered and was on the table until Mr. Trump was elected. We also look quite often at, do we get 50% emissions coverage? So looking at both the 0.1 here on the CGB scale, the club goods benefit scale, and 50% or around 50% coverage gives you something meaningful. But also look at 0 club goods level. So what do we find here? The first here, if it's in gray, these are always the leaders. And you see if the US were continuing as an Obama 2, then at levels of some trade benefits, additional ones, you get roughly a coalition of covering 45 percentage points of global gross product, undertaking 1% or higher emission reductions per year. Of course, you see the version with China, you see a US-EU coalition, or all of the three. If all of the three would come together, even without club benefits, they immediately would cover 50% of global emissions, with a yearly program to spend 1% of their GDP. However, row 1 is, I think, extremely unlikely to materialize given the current administration. So this here, the top row, is for reference. These look like the infeasible solutions. China alone, by the way, cannot do it, regardless of how nice the club goods benefits are. So it will normally need at least some other country, like the EU, to get at, let's say, 30, 35 percentage points. And only under extremely generous conditions can this go up to a universal coalition. However, and this is where the dashed line versus the solid lines come in, the solid line here means the US is willing to be a follower, meaning being invited and then join on cost-benefit terms that are profitable to itself. However, if it doesn't do this, then the dashed line comes into play. Then those 14 percentage points will be missing here, even under extremely generous club good benefits. So what we normally see is it will be difficult to get 50%, except if you have extremely ingenuous club good benefits. And at times, you know, the gap here is rather substantial, with the US being an outsider versus a follower. After all, in all these three rows, it cannot be a leader by assumption. Basic countries are essentially Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And if for the BRICS you add Russia, meaning other major emitters. We can look at the whole thing actually in terms of taking the difference for the last three rows between the dashed line and the solid line. And then you see the big differences are normally at quite generous club goods benefits, but they're quite often also no differences, meaning zero. So it seems that at least under a range of conditions, the US getting out is not outright fatal to the rest of the world trying to build climate mitigation clubs. Well, we allowed for one more tweak here. We allowed for upgrading of the commitments by the leaders. And again, on selfish grounds, it asks itself, if I invite others that are politically proximate and would benefit, do I increase my financial outlays, my membership fee for leaders only, in order to entice more of the emissions to be covered by new additional members? What you see then there is all of the graphs that I've shown you before, meaning 2 slides earlier, become substantially more gradual. It's much more finely granulated. You find also sometimes more, again, these are the references when the US is in some sort of coalition with the other big two. These are the ones where the US is not in a leadership position, but with the solid lines being the US a follower and the dashed line being the US being an outsider. So China by itself, and again, cannot manage if you have a 0.1 club good benefit scale point. The EU can go some way as before, but obviously there's a 14 percentage point gap. The EU and China can more or less get a club going with 30, 35%, even if the US stays out. But if the US comes in, then half of global emissions would be covered by the club membership fee, meaning undertaking mitigation. Again, I show you now only the differences, and now they are there's much more variance. For the obvious reasons, we have much more finely granulated results. The differences are normally highest for high levels on the club good scale. But here we allow essentially the leaders to upgrade their commitments. But again, if you go back, there are very few conditions where the US disengagement, whatever form it takes, is fatal to the rest of the world. But quite often 14 percentage points will be missed. This is a completely different algorithm, and this is essentially the discount on the membership fee. Essentially, it asks, if you look at the left column, enthusiasts or leaders, they start, like before, in the gray areas of the graphics. And I look essentially for how much, or how little actually, in terms of GDP do I have to give up to pull somebody in. So I don't make generalized offers, I look for specific targets of opportunity. So I look for this, well, what some cost-benefit people 30 years called the biggest bang for the buck. Here is the biggest emission reductions for any US dollar invested. In these constellations, the first four, you can, with the US fully in as a leader, you can get up to nearly, well, 95% of emissions covered. That's quite a coalition with 109 members. And at minimum, in the constellations we looked at systematically, at least 2/3 of the emissions are covered. If the US is out, then only this lower part of the graphs comes into play. And what we see is if we use this mechanism of side payment, meaning highly targeted offers, we normally are, except if it's started by the vulnerable 30, we get into the magnitude of half of global emissions to 2/3. This is not quite as good as if the US would be a leader. But again, we don't end up normally with something around 0 or 10%. Again, US absence is not fatal, but it's missed. So let me summarize quickly. The US reluctance, meaning it either moving from leader to follower or from leader to outsider, comes definitely at a cost under most constellations to club size and the mitigation efforts undertaken worldwide. It's rarely outright fatal. The changes from essentially the US being a leader and then from leader to follower are larger than those changes that we see if it switches from follower to outsider. Under very specific conditions that we can discuss, and I brought the tables with me, there is a follow-on effect, meaning others follow the US, sometimes Brazil and India. But sometimes also under other conditions, new ones come in and replace the US, like India does. And in general, we find that the differences at high club good scales with the US being in or out in some form are the lowest. At present, and that is an outlook, we are currently working on a completely new model that actually has also a bottom-up approach. It's also an agent-based model, but we look at the institutional architecture of the Paris Agreement with the global stock take, transparency and review requirements, etc., and reciprocity and trust in reviews, etc., to see under which, and we currently see only very few conditions, that a 2-degree goal can be reached. With this, I thank you and take all your questions. There's a microphone in the room.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I have two different questions. One is in the ABM, in the agent-based model. Could you say a little more about how the leadership forms? It wasn't entirely clear when you start with the individual actors, how the leadership cadre is created.
How a leader becomes a leader?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask this right away and I'll take your questions afterwards.
Okay.
A leader is a leader in this model by assumption. We ask ourselves, who are the top 3 emitters? We could have taken the top 4, which would include also India, and then take permutations. US alone, each of the others alone, then any combinations of 2, any combinations of 3. What we have, and we have been working on, and is we want to think, we have been working on conceptualizing, disaggregating this, meaning internal domestic political incentives to choose your role, leader or follower in principle, or potentially outsider. That I haven't shown. It's clearly on our agenda. We have gone through 4 different versions that are, many of them are appealing, but we don't have the data. We want to calibrate our model as far as possible with real, observable, and reproducible data, and high quality data. So that's where we run into limitations. If you have an idea how to overcome this, that's the reason I stopped you with the second question is, please let us know and we're in business. Your second question.
Alas, I don't. The other question is about the club benefits. Are there actually, at this point, such club benefits in operation, and why don't they run afoul of WTO strictures?
Okay, we looked at the WTO question, and that's a tricky issue for most trade lawyers and trade economists. There are exceptions to general rules like preferential trade status, especially for developing countries, for instance. I forgot, it's Article X or something like that. There are currently negotiations on an environmental goods agreement. As far as I know, they haven't been concluded, but I've asked the people who advise those, and they have non-excludable benefits. I mean, there will be a group of 30 to 50 countries that tries to conclude an agreement, but exclusion, if it is passed and ratified, etc., there will be no practical exclusion. At least that's what the anticipation is of those policy wonks nearby. So in that sense, we have a theoretical construct. However, I've also shown you results for club goods scale at 0, meaning it doesn't exist. So there are a range of conditions under which it's possible, even without members-only benefits, to build climate clubs, but it becomes substantially easier once you can offer something that is exclusive to members only. In the real world, essentially, we would have to, if one thinks of the WTO, we would have to allow for some sort of discrimination, for instance, for time, let's say for 10 years, in order for club members to have temporary benefits before we open it to everyone. This said, if you think about the Montreal Protocol, there's an exemption for developing countries, either under being small emitters, and even then they have to normally follow 10 years later. This would be kind of the inverse of that rule. You have to give temporary incentives potentially under a revised WTO agreement in order to make it happen. Thanks. Other questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So I have a question about what happens when people are involved, either as a leader or a follower, and in your model, my understanding is that they're looking at two issues. One is their fee, and the other is the benefit they get from the trade partnership. But there's also the issue that may be a psychological or a political issue of the fact that the global benefit of curbing greenhouse gas emissions does go to everyone, not just to the people involved in the climate club. And so the people that are not participating are freeloaders.
Yep.
And so even if in your graphs there's an issue of what is the overall benefit if the U.S. or other large emitters drop out, the fact that the individual benefit to that country may or may not be affected, the fact that another large group of people is getting a benefit and not contributing to that benefit can still play a role in their decision making, whether that's rational or not, we could discuss. But I was wondering how that plays a role in your models or in your thinking about this process.
There's a two-pronged answer. One is with the present model, exactly what we have, we allow free loaders or free riders to benefit, even if they stay out, except on the club members only benefit. Second is in our new model, we have a reciprocity clause, meaning country A, before it makes its nationally determined contribution for the future, meaning post-2025 or post-2030, looks at the compliance record of others and what others pledge. So in a future model, this is included, but not in the present one. The reciprocity part. Other questions?
So, I was going to say, I'm thinking of a Stephen Bernstein paper on God gave physicists the kind of the easy problems, called the kind of the physics envy in political science, and he was trying to predict whether or not nation states are likely to go to war, right? And you know, the kind of the main take home for someone like me from a paper like that is that this is really, you have very low confidence in your projections. And I'm just wondering how much confidence you have in your projections, given that you're having to make predictions about what nation states are doing.
Well, I've applied for a grant on the prediction course. This is not a prediction. An agent-based model is essentially nothing else than, I don't forgot, this is 10,000 runs. The new model, we have 1 million runs. It's highly structured and empirically calibrated what-if questions. So we don't make a policy prediction. But I'm happy to teach a course on that. And I have it actually in the making. And Ben and I were collaborating on this. So you're on safe territory. The point is, I think I take it from me, is what is your empirical validation of what I've showed? The unfortunate answer for me is I have to become very old, because the architecture is reasonably new. Many of the exact provisions of the Paris Agreements, and I've been reading up on this the last few days for our future work, are extremely vague. And if Kyoto and the agreement is any guidance, it takes normally a few years to write the executive rules of the Paris Agreement. So unfortunately, I fear I have to become old, and I hopefully become reasonably old since I have young daughters, to witness is which of these combinations realized and whether this was properly captured by the model. Until then, our open access model, I hope, is still runnable by future generations of PhD students to see not only what is the observation, but replicate the conditions that went into that forward projection.
I've got a kind of related question, but from a different angle. And that the background is to think about these three different approaches to thinking about effectiveness in general. Oslo-Potsdam, which you've done here, is consistent with that overall thinking about how nation states behave. More of a Oren Young institutionalist, sort of hybrid approach. He agrees on some things, but not all things, because norms matter more in his kind of conversation. And then Gabrielle Cutting, who says actually historical factors, the growth of capitalism, and so on, matter a lot more than we can get into in terms of these kinds of models. So with those kinds of three schools in mind, and you know them well, and thinking about David Victor, and you and I have engaged in David Victor's analysis, but Victor, who fits, I think, overall into your overall sort of Oslo-Potsdam orientation, has argued that Paris was at once a success, okay, and he talks about and explains why, but then also says in the same analysis that the 2 degrees goals are unrealistic, and we need new goals that are higher than 2 degrees, which to me negates his first point. How can it be successful if it can't meet its 2 degrees goals? And the answer is he doesn't look at success in terms of meeting the goals. Success was the agreement itself, and why did that actually happen? So I'm curious in your model whether part of the challenge is what do we actually, given the complex nature of the world and the historical ways in which emissions have emerged and the growth of capitalism, whether we can get to a 2 degrees solution with this kind of framework. Now, it's partly predictive kind of question, but it's also partly more, is the actual model itself needing to be enhanced by other, Bernstein-esque perspective to think about whether 2 degrees is something we can really achieve with this kind of sort of clubs approach.
The present model doesn't endogenize the impact of mitigation efforts over time on reduced damages. Think of it as model 1.0, and the Trump version is model 1.1. The current model, version 2, asks explicitly the question, we give you a carbon budget from the IPCC within certain ranges, so we run sensitivity analysis, and how in a pledging procedure with nationally determined contributions and a few other institutional tweaks, can this be achieved or not? And by far, my memory says we have 1 million runs, And out of this, less than 1,000, under all the combinations we went through, and I think it's more closer to 500, lead to any achievement. These are very optimistic assumptions.
Right.
So reaching 2 degrees, not to mention 1.5, assuming our model is correct, the data are correct, and there's no malfeasance by the computers themselves, shows that it will be very difficult to reach. This is not so surprising to many people at my institute. We had a discussion on the 1.5 degree goal, and it will be difficult to reach. There's a little bit more hope for 2 degrees, but it will take extraordinary efforts. I think the notion of effectiveness in this context, if it's translated into reaching an ambitious goal, then our model 2 hopefully gives the configuration of likely values that lead to that, with all the assumptions I just made before. But I don't like to talk much about a model where we are still at the debugging stage and making sure it works properly.
Yeah.
But it's not surprising because we have other evidence from other modeling communities. They don't use agent-based model. How small the solution space is for a 2 degree goal. Yeah. It amounts to essentially absent path-breaking technological innovation, and this would be an enormous effort with current technology and behavioral change. It doesn't mean it cannot happen. It just doesn't say that we can look around the corner and we'll see it in the near future.
So, thank you very much. I have a question about the structure of the club. I'm curious, have you looked at potentially running models with different types of clubs and membership and institutional structure? And the reason why I'm asking is because of Article 7.2c of the UNFCCC, which you're familiar with, I'm assuming, but essentially that there's an article within the UN Framework Convention that would, where countries could invoke the Secretariat to help them facilitate coordinated measures together. And to my knowledge, all of the research and literature around climate clubs hasn't necessarily touched on that, and I was wondering if you think that some kind of structure within the UN Secretariat or maybe outside could help facilitate clubs, or if it's really just about the membership.
Well, you're into institutional design of clubs. We have an extremely simple system of this open membership. If you pay the fee, you're in. You cannot be kept out. We check this if you have major war between some of the countries, whether it matters in how dense your trade relations are among the top 10 traders in the world, to see if our fundamental results would change. So having maybe stratified memberships, as some people, for instance, suggest, might be an option. We didn't model it. It would be very complex, most likely. And we haven't thought about it. We first wanted to get one system going and see how it behaves, and then you normally make it more complicated and understand the structure before, and actually also its pitfalls. This said, I had a similar, maybe related idea. I went to actually one of the greatest emitters in the transport sector worldwide and gave a very short version of this and some other presentation. And then the person who invited me suggested, why don't we do this for the top club among the 200 top emitting firms in the world? Actually, I checked up, there are such data, and some of our colleagues in the global environmental politics field have pointed me to resources. But we would need some insight on the behavioral rules before we build a good model. Then unfortunately, the person who was so interested and suggested this over lunch went on maternity leave. And I know will be posted in a new position further up in that chain of a big company. And unfortunately, that meant, although I went to the executive board, they didn't show too much interest to pursue that. I think you need, in order to make a good model, you do not only need mathematical formula, you need also descriptive insight how things work, and then try to have an abstract, highly simplified version thereof. And for that, you need somebody who is in that field. And unfortunately, we lost that link, although I found it really tempting. I've seen a small version of that on the provincial level and the state level here at the East and the West Coast with its ups and downs. But why wouldn't California be, if you take it now the state level and provincial level, California, BC, and others join, let's say, the state of Berlin and maybe Bavaria and a few other areas in Europe and maybe in Asia in building a transnational network. Our reasoning doesn't preclude that. The only thing that we need, and I think the computational power issue we get solved. Our heating in the new building is actually the super parallel computer in the basement. So we need it in winter. But we would need good data. I think that is the great practical restrictions that we have seen at times also with looking at disaggregating the nation state. If you know how to overcome this, you're invited for lunch and a long, long conversation, and hopefully later on some good results that are illuminating what way we come out, we'll see. So if you know how to overcome that, I would be most grateful.
I'm very intrigued by the firm-based model given the presence of the Carbon Disclosure Project and the fact that some firms are reporting. It seems like your agent-based model imposes very simple behavioral requirements on the agents. So why the need for deeper descriptions of the firms? And if you're doing a what if you set up the what if rules in the agents that say, here's the gross revenue or something like that, and a few and some vulnerability indices, why do you need to go deeper in order to play these what if games?
I think with the new model, to some degree, we do. We found out all of what I showed you is computed on a laptop. 10,000 runs were not a problem. The new model has 5 minutes on a laptop. We needed 1 million runs. So it took us quite a while with very good infrastructure to get the new model run, which is, again, highly aggregate, not quite as aggregate as this. It has more bells and whistles and a different architecture. So if you want to disaggregate more and have more complicated rules?
No, I want rules that are as simple as what these appear to be. And I'm asking if those rules are as simple as I understand them to be, why do you need to go out and get more behavioral information about the firms? It sounds like you could posit some basic agent rules that don't require that research.
I think I would like to know how much reciprocity they need on the practical level. I've talked to these people over the years, and they try to establish environmental labels. This is the environmental branch of a major transport company or logistics company. So I know they were interested, but they didn't succeed for quite a while. And it was not lack for money and not lack of interest. So there are some things that we do not fully understand. Of course, we can say we leave this reciprocity parameter, or what minimum coalition you need among large businesses to establish a standard. We could do that. Principally, that is possible. The question is, how many parameter spaces do you want to go through? And sometimes it's good to put some limits on the range just to get results in a reasonable amount of time. But if computational restrictions are not an object, then I think we could do that. So principally, it's possible. We have to keep an eye on a little bit also on doability. All these nice, highly granulated graphs are actually not lines. These are dots. They're just so dense from the 10,000 plus runs that they look like lines.
Let me just say, thinking about the talk and the questions, that one of the most important questions facing students of environmental governance globally is to think about why states cooperate and why don't they cooperate. and the conditions under which we might get actually meaningful interaction among states. And Detlef's work in that regard over the last 25 years has been unparalleled to really understand better, using this very sophisticated approach, how we might get into these insights and what they mean for commitments. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us a little bit of the great work that you're doing on these really important questions. So join me in thanking Detlef.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, thank you. One second, let me take off the mic.